April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Dawn breaks over the Pacific Ocean as the largest amphibious assault force in the history of the Pacific War approaches the shores of a small island. Over 1,600 ships carrying more than 180,000 American soldiers and Marines converge on Okinawa, an island most Americans had never heard of, yet one that would become the stage for the bloodiest battle of the Pacific theater. This is the story of 82 days that would change the course of history. A battle so ferocious it earned the name the Typhoon of Steel. A battle where the sky rained fire, where the earth swallowed armies whole, and where the line between soldier and civilian, between life and death, became tragically blurred. Welcome to the Battle of Okinawa, the final, desperate struggle before the gates of Japan itself. To understand the significance of Okinawa, we must first understand the journey that brought American forces to its shores. Since August 1942, the United States had been methodically island-hopping across the Pacific, a strategy designed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and capture strategic islands that could serve as stepping stones toward the Japanese homeland. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each name became synonymous with brutal combat, with young men fighting and dying on volcanic rock and coral atolls thousands of miles from home. But each victory brought American forces closer to their ultimate objective, Japan itself. By early 1945, the noose was tightening. American B-29 superfortresses were already firebombing Japanese cities from bases in the Mariana Islands. The Japanese Navy had been shattered at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Germany was on the brink of collapse in Europe, but the path to victory in the Pacific remained drenched in blood. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, represented the final stepping stone. Located just 350 miles south of the Japanese mainland, this island measured roughly 60 miles long and up to 20 miles wide. Its possession would provide the Allies with airfields capable of supporting a full-scale invasion of Japan's home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall. American planners needed Okinawa, and the Japanese knew it. For the Japanese Empire, Okinawa was more than strategic, it was sacred. This was the first piece of official Japanese sovereign territory to face invasion. Its loss would mean enemy forces stood at the very doorstep of the homeland, threatening the emperor himself and the 2,000-year legacy of Japan. The stage was set for a confrontation of unprecedented scale and savagery. The American invasion plan for Okinawa, designated Operation Iceberg, was audacious in its scope. Under the overall command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, the operation would involve a staggering assemblage of military might. The Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, provided naval support with more than 1,600 ships, the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific. Ground forces consisted of the newly created 10th Army under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. This combined force of Army and Marine Corps units included the 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions, along with the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Marine Divisions. It even had its own Tactical Air Force, a joint Army-Marine command that represented unprecedented cooperation between the services. In the weeks before the invasion, American forces softened up the target. As early as October 1944, airstrikes had been pounding Okinawa's defenses. In March 1945, Carrier Task Force 58 under Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air. The British Pacific Fleet, operating as Task Force 57, joined the assault, targeting Japanese airfields in the nearby Sakishima Islands and Formosa to prevent reinforcements from reaching Okinawa. On March 26, the preliminary phase began when the Army's 77th Infantry Division seized the Kurama Islands, small islands just 15 miles west of Okinawa. This operation secured a protected anchorage for the invasion fleet and eliminated the threat from Japanese suicide boats hidden in the island's coves. The cost was relatively light: 27 Americans killed and 81 wounded, with over 650 Japanese casualties. But these preliminary operations also revealed the dark reality of what was to come. On March 28, on tiny Tokashiki Island, 394 civilians were forced by Japanese soldiers to commit mass suicide after American troops landed, a horrifying foreshadowing of the tragedy that would engulf Okinawa's civilian population. As March turned to April, American naval forces completed their final preparations. Underwater demolition teams cleared the landing beaches of obstacles. Minesweepers swept the approaches. Naval bombardment reached a crescendo as battleships pounded suspected defensive positions with their massive guns. The Americans expected fierce resistance on the beaches, another bloody D-Day, another Iwo Jima. Ships carried extra medical supplies and body bags. Marines and soldiers wrote final letters home, their stomachs knotted with the anticipation of what dawn would bring. April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, at dawn, after a massive naval bombardment that seemed to shake the very foundations of the island, the first wave of landing craft approached the beaches at Higuchi on Okinawa's western coast. Soldiers and Marines braced themselves for the storm of steel they'd experienced. At other Pacific landings, the machine gun fire, the artillery explosions, the screams of wounded men falling in the surf. But as the landing craft lowered their ramps and troops splashed ashore, they encountered something completely unexpected. Silence. There was no resistance, no gunfire, no explosions, no bodies floating in the water. Within hours, over 60,000 American troops had come ashore and established a beachhead nearly 5 miles long. By nightfall, they'd advanced inland and captured 2 of Okinawa's airfields virtually unopposed. Some Marines joked that it was the best April Fool's joke ever played, but veteran officers knew better. This eerily peaceful landing was no gift, it was a trap. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, the 58-year-old commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, had over 100,000 troops under his command, along with thousands of conscripted Okinawan civilians. But Ushijima was no fool. He witnessed what happened when Japanese forces tried to contest American landings on other islands. They were obliterated by overwhelming naval gunfire and air power before the battle even began. So, Ushijima had devised a different strategy, one born from the bitter lessons of previous defeats. He withdrew his forces into the southern third of Okinawa, where the terrain was most favorable for defense. Here, in the rugged hills surrounding the ancient Shuri Castle, Japanese engineers had spent months creating an elaborate defensive system. They dug tunnels deep into the hillsides, carved out fortified caves, and established interlocking fields of fire from reverse slopes that naval guns couldn't reach. Ushijima's plan was simple but devastating. Let the Americans come ashore, let them advance, and then bleed them white in a war of attrition among the hills and ridges of southern Okinawa. Every day the Americans were pinned down on Okinawa was another day the ships of the Fifth Fleet remained anchored off the coast vulnerable to Japan's ultimate weapon, the kamikaze. As American forces moved inland on those first quiet days of April, they had no idea that they were walking into a killing ground that would make Iwo Jima look like a skirmish. While soldiers and Marines fought for yards of blood-soaked earth on Okinawa, the sailors of the Fifth Fleet faced their own nightmare from the sky, a nightmare with a name, kamikaze, the divine wind. The concept of suicide attacks was not new by April 1945. Japan had first employed kamikaze tactics during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when conventional air attacks had proven ineffective against American ships equipped with devastating anti-aircraft defenses. But at Okinawa, the kamikaze attacks reached a scale and intensity never before witnessed in warfare. Japan launched Operation Tengo, a desperate, all-out aerial offensive designed to destroy the American invasion fleet and leave the ground forces stranded on Okinawa without support. The plan called for 10 massive, coordinated kamikaze attacks, which the Japanese called kaikosui, meaning floating chrysanthemums, a poetic name for an utterly horrific reality. April 6, 1945, 5 days after the initial landing, marked the beginning of Kaikosui no 1. At 3 in the afternoon, radar operators aboard American ships detected an impossible sight: 355 kamikaze aircraft and 344 fighter escorts bearing down on the fleet. The attack lasted 5 hours and tested the mettle of even the most hardened sailors. Picture this. You're a 19-year-old sailor on a destroyer, manning an anti-aircraft gun. The sky fills with dozens of Japanese aircraft. You open fire, tracers arcing into the sky. You hit one plane and it explodes in midair. You hit another and pieces fly off, but it keeps coming, keeps diving straight at your ship. The pilot is already dead, committed to his mission, and nothing, not your bullets, not your prayers, will turn him aside. You can see his face in the cockpit as he crashes into the ship next to yours, creating a fireball that engulfs the entire vessel. This was the daily reality for American sailors off Okinawa. 21-year-old John Chapman, a gun captain aboard the destroyer USS Newcomb, described watching the kamikazes approach. There was probably 45 planes in the air. Well, it was a scary situation because you knew that they were going to dive on you. You could be firing on the aircraft and they'd come right on, just keep coming right on through that. And you'd see pieces flying over the planes and everything else, and they just keep right on a-coming. The Newcomb shot down 4 enemy planes on April 6th. 5 others hit the ship. The vessel became a roaring inferno, but the crew fought desperately, not just to put out fires and save their ship, but to keep firing at the kamikazes that kept coming. The statistics tell a story of unprecedented destruction. Between late March and June 1945, Japan launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze attacks against the Allied fleet at Okinawa. These attacks sank 36 American warships and damaged 368 others. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed and another 5,000 wounded, the worst losses the U.S. Navy suffered in any single battle of World War II. The destroyers positioned on radar picket duty, stationed between the main fleet and the Japanese home islands to provide early warning of attacks, bore the brunt of the onslaught. Ships like the USS Bush, USS Colquhoun, and USS Emmons were sunk. The destroyer USS Laffey earned the nickname the ship that would not die after surviving 6 kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes in a single day. Aircraft carriers weren't spared either. The USS Bunker Hill, one of the Navy's prized Essex-class carriers, was struck by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds on May 11th. The explosions killed 396 men and wounded hundreds more, leaving the ship a burning wreck that would never see combat again. The USS Franklin, hit in March before Okinawa operations began, suffered over 800 killed and missing one of the highest casualty counts for any ship in U.S. naval history. For the Japanese pilots, these missions represented the ultimate sacrifice. Many were young men barely out of their teens, some with minimal flight training due to fuel shortages and the decimation of experienced pilots in previous battles. Before their final missions, they would write farewell letters to their families. Flight Lieutenant Haro Araki, a 21-year-old newlywed, wrote to his wife the night before his final mission, "Tomorrow I will dive my plane into an enemy ship. I will cross the river into the other world, taking some Yankees with me. When I look back, I see that I was very cold-hearted to you. After I had been cruel to you, I used to regret it. Please forgive me, but the reality was often different from the propaganda." As Japan's situation grew more desperate, volunteers for kamikaze duty dried up. Increasingly, pilots were conscripted for suicide missions, some flying drunk and bitter to their deaths. One pilot even strafed his own command post after takeoff, a final act of rebellion against orders that represented a national death sentence. The kamikaze attacks failed to achieve their strategic objective. They didn't drive away the Fifth Fleet or doom the American ground forces, but they exacted a terrible psychological toll. As one Navy commander stated, suicide attacks represented the most difficult anti-aircraft problem yet faced by the fleet. While the naval battle raged offshore, American ground forces discovered the true nature of the trap Ushijima had prepared for them in southern Okinawa. The Marines, tasked with securing northern Okinawa, encountered stiff resistance but achieved their objectives relatively quickly by mid-April. They captured the Motobu Peninsula after intense fighting that cost over 1,000 casualties. But their success in the north proved to be the exception. In the south, Army divisions advancing toward Shuri Castle ran headlong into a defensive system unlike anything they'd encountered before. The Japanese had transformed the natural terrain landscape of ridges, ravines, and limestone hills into a labyrinth of death. The first major obstacle was the Shuri defense line, anchored around the ancient castle. Here, Japanese forces had established a triangle of mutually supporting positions. Soldiers hid in fortified caves carved deep into the hillsides. Artillery and machine guns were positioned on reverse slopes, invisible to American observers and immune to naval bombardment. The positions were connected by tunnels that allowed Japanese troops to move unseen, to emerge, strike, and disappear like ghosts. Each ridge, each hill, each cave had to be taken individually, often at the cost of dozens or hundreds of lives. Places with names like Kakazu Ridge, Tombstone Ridge, and Sugarloaf Hill became synonymous with savage, close-quarters combat. At Kakazu Ridge, American troops charged up the slopes again and again, only to be cut down by withering fire from defenders they couldn't see. The Japanese would allow attackers to crest the ridge, then annihilate them with artillery fire from neighboring hills. For days, American forces threw themselves at these positions with next to no progress. The battle for Sugarloaf Hill epitomizes the grinding nature of the Southern campaign. To Marines approaching on May 12th, it looked like an insignificant bump in the terrain, something they could take in a day or less. 8 days later, after 6 major assaults and countless smaller attacks, they learned how wrong they were. Sugarloaf was part of a triangular defensive system with 2 other hills. Taking one hill meant being exposed to fire from the other 2. The Marines would fight their way to the top, only to be driven off by counterattacks or artillery. They'd regroup, attack again, suffer casualties, withdraw, attack, suffer, withdraw, the cycle repeated with mechanical, nightmarish regularity. One Marine described it as an invisible meat grinder grinding up Marines. When Sugarloaf finally fell on May 18th, entire companies had been decimated. The hill changed hands more than a dozen times in those 8 days, and the ground was so saturated with blood that it turned the mud a dark reddish-brown. The weather added another layer of misery. In May, the spring rains came, transforming Okinawa into a quagmire. Foxholes filled with water. Tanks bogged down in mud so deep that they became stationary targets. Supply lines turned into rivers of muck. The dead could always be recovered and were sometimes left to decompose in the tropical heat and rain. The smell of death became inescapable, permeating everything. Admiral Nimitz, frustrated by the slow progress and concerned about the mounting naval losses from kamikaze attacks, complained to General Buckner that the Navy was losing about a ship and a half a day while tethered to Okinawa supporting the ground forces. He urged Buckner to consider an amphibious end run around the Japanese defenses, landing Marines on the southern coast to attack Ushijima's positions from the rear. But Buckner refused, believing such a maneuver would be too risky and that methodical pressure would eventually crack the Japanese defenses. Instead, he reinforced his attacking forces, bringing in the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions to relieve exhausted Army units. The fresh Marines brought new energy to the assault, but the grinding attrition continued. Japanese tactics were designed to maximize American casualties. Small unit counterattacks harassed American positions constantly. Snipers picked off officers and medics. Mortar teams appeared, fired a few rounds, and disappeared into their tunnel networks before American artillery could respond. Every yard of ground cost lives. The American forces adapted. They brought up flamethrower tanks to blast defenders out of caves. Engineers used explosives to seal cave entrances, entombing the occupants. Artillery and naval gunfire pounded Japanese positions relentlessly. Slowly, inexorably, the Shuri line began to crumble. On May 29th, after weeks of the most brutal combat of the Pacific War, American forces captured Shuri Castle itself. The Confederate flag was briefly raised over the ruins before being replaced by the Stars and Stripes on General Buckner's orders. But the victory was bittersweet. Ushijima had already withdrawn the bulk of his remaining forces to a final defensive line on the Keihan Peninsula at the island's southern tip. The fighting would continue for nearly another month. Perhaps no aspect of the Battle of Okinawa is more heartbreaking than the fate of the island's civilian population. Okinawa wasn't some remote military outpost. It was home to approximately 490,000 civilians, most living in the southern third of the island where the heaviest fighting occurred. These people found themselves trapped between 2 armies, neither of which could guarantee their safety. Before the battle, some 80,000 Okinawans had been evacuated to mainland Japan. Many died when their ships were torpedoed by American submarines, but the vast majority of civilians remained on the island when the Americans landed. Japanese propaganda had painted a terrifying picture of American soldiers as barbaric monsters who would torture and murder any civilians they captured. Educational indoctrination had taught Okinawans that death was preferable to the dishonor of surrender. Zinichi Oshimin, a child during the battle, recalled the propaganda. "We were taught that the Americans and the British were kichiku, or ogre beasts. The Americans were monsters and beasts and not humans. So, if you were caught by them, you would have your ears and nose cut off, be blinded, and be run over by the tanks. If you were a woman, you would be raped." As the American advance pushed south, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled ahead of the fighting, joining Japanese military forces in their retreat. By late May, the southern tip of Okinawa had become a nightmare landscape of soldiers, civilians, caves, artillery fire, and chaos. Many civilians hid in caves, often the same caves used by Japanese forces. When American troops approached these positions, they couldn't distinguish between military defenders and terrified families. The caves would be hit with flamethrowers, explosives, or sealed shut. Entire families perished. Japanese soldiers often commandeered the best cave shelters, forcing civilians into the open or into less protected positions. They sent Okinawans, including women and children, out at gunpoint to gather water and supplies, exposing them to American fire. Some Japanese units murdered civilians who possessed food or water that the soldiers wanted for themselves. The Japanese military also enforced a horrific policy of collective suicide in some areas, based on the twisted logic that death was preferable to capture. On multiple occasions, Japanese soldiers ordered civilians to kill themselves, distributing hand grenades to families huddled in caves. Those who refused were sometimes killed by the soldiers themselves. Shig Nakahodo, another child survivor, described the nightmare at Nobuni in late June. "We encountered a hell on earth. We saw dead bodies, crying and screaming people, and a person who was begging to be shot to death. It was like hell. I didn't know such a hell existed in this world." The civilian death toll remains difficult to calculate precisely. Conservative estimates suggest at least 100,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle, roughly 1/4 of the island's population. Some estimates range as high as 150,000. Many were caught in crossfire, killed by artillery or airstrikes, or died from starvation and disease. Others were murdered by Japanese forces or forced into suicide. These deaths had a lasting impact on the Okinawan people. After the war, there was deep resentment toward both the Japanese military for the forced suicides and callous treatment, and toward the continued American military presence on the island. The Battle of Okinawa created generational trauma that persists to this day. Among the survivors was a young Japanese schoolboy named Masahide Titie, who hid in the hills as the battle raged around him. He would go on to become the governor of Okinawa Prefecture and spent much of his life documenting the civilian suffering during the battle, ensuring that the tragedy would not be forgotten. Amid the chaos of the Okinawa campaign, one of history's most dramatic naval episodes unfolded in early April: the death ride of the battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever built. At 863 feet long and displacing over 72,000 tons, the Yamato was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. As part of Operation Tengo, Japanese naval commanders devised a suicide mission for the Yamato. She would sail to Okinawa with a light cruiser, the Yahagi, and 8 destroyers. The fleet carried only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The plan was to fight through the American fleet, beach the Yamato on Okinawa shores, and use her massive guns as coastal artillery, while her crew of over 2,700 men became naval infantry fighting alongside Ushijima's defenders. It was a desperate plan, born of desperation. The Japanese Navy, once the master of the Pacific, had been reduced to a force barely capable of offensive operations. But on April 6, 1945, the Yamato and her escorts departed from Japan's inland sea on their final voyage. They never came close to reaching Okinawa. American submarines spotted the Japanese fleet almost immediately after it left Japanese waters and shadowed it throughout the night, sending regular position reports to the Fifth Fleet. Admiral Spruance and his commanders decided that carrier aircraft would be more than sufficient to deal with the threat. No American battleships would be needed to engage the Yamato in a surface action. On the morning of April 7th, Admiral Mark Mitcher launched waves of aircraft from Task Force 58 over 300 bombers and torpedo planes from multiple carriers. The Japanese fleet had no air cover. There were no aircraft to spare from the kamikaze operations. The American pilots were instructed to focus their torpedo attacks on one side of the Yamato to prevent effective counter-flooding, a brilliant tactical decision. They were also told to aim for the bow and stern where the armor was thinnest. For more than 2 hours, wave after wave of American aircraft attacked the doomed Japanese ships. The Yamato fought back desperately, her anti-aircraft guns creating a curtain of flak in the sky. She twisted and turned, trying to evade the torpedo bombers diving on her from all directions. But it was hopeless. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into her port side, listing the ship heavily. Bombs crushed through her decks, starting fires and destroying her machinery spaces. At 2:23 p.m., after being struck by an estimated 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs, the Yamato capsized and exploded. The explosion was so massive that it created a mushroom cloud visible 100 miles away. Of her crew of 2,767 men, only 269 survived. Admiral Seiichi Itoa, the fleet commander, went down with his ship. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sunk in the engagement. In total, Japan lost approximately 3,700 sailors. The Americans lost just 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. The sinking of the Yamato symbolized the complete collapse of Japanese naval power. The world's most powerful battleship had been destroyed without ever firing her main guns at an enemy surface ship. It was a testament to how thoroughly carrier-based air power had changed naval warfare, and a preview of how helpless Japan would be against the might of the American military. By early June, the outcome on Okinawa was no longer in doubt. American forces had broken through the Shuri Line and were pressing Ushijima's remaining forces into an ever-shrinking pocket on the Keihan Peninsula. But the Japanese commander had no intention of surrendering. The fighting in the final weeks reached new levels of desperation. Japanese soldiers, knowing they were doomed, fought with suicidal ferocity. Some launched banzai charges, futile attacks into American machine gun fire. Others held their positions until being killed by flamethrowers or buried alive when their caves were blown shut. American casualties continued to mount. On June 4th, Marines launched an amphibious assault at Naha, seizing the airfield there, but each gain came at a price measured in blood. On June 18th, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the commander of the 10th Army, was observing the final offensive from a forward observation post. Japanese artillery spotted the position and opened fire. Shrapnel from an exploding shell struck Buckner in the chest, severing an artery. He died within minutes, becoming the highest-ranking American general killed in action during World War II. Command passed to Marine General Roy Geiger, who pressed the offensive relentlessly. By June 21st, American forces had reached the southern coast of Okinawa and compressed the remaining Japanese defenders into a few small pockets. That same day, in a cave on Hill 89, Lieutenant General Ushijima faced the reality of defeat. His army had been destroyed, his mission had failed. Following the samurai code of Bushido, Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Sho, committed seppuku ritual suicide by disembowelment in the early morning hours of June 22nd. Before taking his own life, Ushijima had one final order for his senior operations officer, Colonel Hiromiki Yahara. Yahara had asked permission to commit suicide as well, but Ushijima refused. "If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. Bear the temporary shame, but endure it. This is an order from your army commander." Yahara survived, surrendered to American forces, and later wrote a book titled The Battle for Okinawa, preserving the Japanese perspective of the campaign for history. On June 22, 1945, the 10th Army held a flag-raising ceremony to mark the end of organized resistance on Okinawa. Mopping up operations continued through June 30th as scattered Japanese holdouts were hunted down. Even after the official end of the battle, some Japanese soldiers remained hidden in Okinawa's caves. The last verified Japanese soldier to emerge from hiding and surrender did so in 1915 years after the battle ended. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days. When it finally ended, the island had earned its grim nickname, the Typhoon of Steel. The casualty figures tell a story of unprecedented destruction. American losses were staggering. The ground forces suffered approximately 49,000 casualties, including over 12,500 killed or missing. The breakdown showed the terrible toll: 4,675 Army soldiers killed, 2,938 Marines killed, and 4,907 Navy personnel killed. Another 33,000 non-battle casualties occurred: men who broke down psychologically under the strain, or who were injured in accidents or succumbed to disease. The Navy's losses were particularly shocking. The kamikaze attacks resulted in nearly 5,000 sailors killed and another 5,000 wounded. More ships were lost or damaged at Okinawa than in any other battle in naval history. In total, 36 Allied ships were sunk and 368 damaged. As historian Hanson Baldwin noted, never before had the Navy lost so many ships. Never before in land fighting had so much American blood been shed in so short a time in so small an area. Japanese military losses were even more catastrophic. Approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers died defending Okinawa. Many chose death over surrender, following the code of Bushido that considered surrender to be the ultimate dishonor. Only about 7,400 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner, many of them too wounded to kill themselves or continue fighting. But the most horrific statistic is the civilian death toll. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if 1 out of every 3 or 4 people in your hometown, your neighbors, your friends, your family, were killed in a single 3-month period. That was the reality for Okinawa. In total, approximately 250,000 people died in the Battle of Okinawa. To put that in perspective, that's more deaths than occurred in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The island's physical infrastructure was almost completely destroyed. The ancient Shuri Castle, a 500-year-old symbol of Okinawan culture, lay in ruins. Entire villages had been wiped off the map. For the Americans, the casualties at Okinawa, particularly when added to the losses at Iwo Jima, raised terrifying questions about the projected invasion of the Japanese home islands. Military planners estimated that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, could result in anywhere from 500,000 to over 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties, both military and civilian, were expected to be in the millions, possibly tens of millions. President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945, looked at these projections with horror. The Battle of Okinawa had demonstrated that the Japanese would fight with fanatical determination to defend their homeland, that they would sacrifice civilians as readily as soldiers, and that they possessed weapons like the kamikazes that could inflict terrible losses even in defeat. The Battle of Okinawa didn't just change the tactical situation in the Pacific, it fundamentally altered the strategic calculus for ending the war. As the battle raged in June 1945, the Manhattan Project was nearing completion. American scientists working in secret facilities across the United States had successfully developed the atomic bomb. On July 16, 1945, the first test of a nuclear weapon lit up the New Mexico desert with a flash brighter than the sun. President Truman now faced an agonizing decision. He could order the invasion of Japan as planned, knowing it would likely result in casualties that would make Okinawa look like a minor skirmish. Or he could employ this new weapon, one so powerful it could destroy an entire city, in the hope of forcing Japan's surrender without an invasion. The experience at Okinawa weighed heavily in Truman's deliberations. General Douglas MacArthur and other military leaders briefed the president on the expected casualties for Operation Downfall. The numbers varied, but all were horrifying. Some estimates suggested that the invasion of Kyushu alone could result in 500,000 American casualties in the first phase. Moreover, Okinawa had demonstrated that Japanese civilians would be caught in any invasion of the home islands, likely in numbers far exceeding what occurred on Okinawa. The Japanese government had mobilized the entire population for defense, training civilians, including women and children, to attack American soldiers with bamboo spears if necessary. The civilian death toll in an invasion of Japan might reach into the millions. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly and tens of thousands more from radiation effects. Japan did not immediately surrender. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 to 80,000 people. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese had ever heard their emperor's voice. World War II was over. The atomic bombs remain controversial to this day, but few historians dispute that the Battle of Okinawa played a crucial role in the decision to use them. The experience of that 82-day bloodbath convinced American leadership that Japan would never surrender without either an invasion that would dwarf any previous operation in human history or a demonstration of overwhelming, previously unimaginable destructive power. The Battle of Okinawa left scars that remain visible 80 years later. For the American military, Okinawa became a case study in amphibious operations, combined arms coordination, and the difficulties of fighting an enemy committed to fighting to the death. The experiences there influenced military doctrine for decades. The battle also highlighted the psychological toll of prolonged, intense combat. Thousands of American servicemen suffered from what was then called combat fatigue and what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. 24 American service members received the Medal of Honor for actions during the Battle of Okinawa. 13 Marines and Navy corpsmen, 9 Army soldiers, and 1 Navy officer. Their acts of heroism, often sacrificing themselves to save their comrades, represent only a fraction of the courage displayed during those 82 days. For Japan, Okinawa represented the final breaking of the military's hold over the nation's destiny. The sacrifice of thousands of civilians, the failure of kamikaze tactics to achieve their objectives, and the complete destruction of the defending forces all contributed to the emperor's decision to accept surrender, ending the militarist dream that had led Japan into war in the first place. For the people of Okinawa, the battle created a unique historical trauma. The island had been an independent kingdom until annexed by Japan in 1879. During the war, Okinawans had been treated as second-class citizens by the Japanese military, forced into service, and ultimately sacrificed in a doomed defense of the Japanese Empire. After the war, Okinawa remained under American military occupation until 1972, and even today, the island hosts a disproportionate share of U.S. military bases in Japan, a source of ongoing controversy and resentment. The mass civilian suicides forced by Japanese military authorities became a particularly contentious issue in Japanese textbooks and public discourse. For decades, some Japanese nationalist historians tried to downplay or deny that Japanese forces had compelled civilians to kill themselves. It was until 2013 that Japanese textbook publishers were permitted to state clearly that the army caused many tragedies in Okinawa, killing local civilians and forcing them to commit mass suicide. The physical scars healed slowly. Shuri Castle, that ancient symbol of Okinawan culture destroyed in the battle, was meticulously reconstructed beginning in the 1980s and reopened as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tragically, it burned down again in 2019 due to an accidental fire, but reconstruction efforts are underway once more, a testament to the Okinawan people's resilience and determination to preserve their heritage. Today, the cornerstone of Peace Memorial stands at the southern tip of Okinawa, near where the final fighting occurred. This monument lists the names of all who died in the Battle of Okinawa, American, Japanese, and Okinawan alike, making no distinction between victor and vanquished, soldier and civilian. When it was unveiled in 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, 234,183 names were inscribed on its black granite walls. New names are still being added as more victims are identified. The Battle of Okinawa stands as one of the most devastating chapters in the history of modern warfare. It was a battle where technological superiority met fanatical determination, where civilians paid the price for military decisions, and where the very concept of victory became tainted by the terrible cost required to achieve it. The Typhoon of Steel raged for 82 days in the spring and summer of 1945, when it finally passed. It left behind an island transformed into a graveyard, a sea littered with the wreckage of ships, and a sky that had been darkened by the smoke of countless fires. But it also marked the beginning of the end, the final bloody chapter before the atomic age would dawn, changing warfare and human history forever. Today, when we look at the pristine beaches of Okinawa, at the rebuilt cities, and the memorials to the fallen, it's hard to imagine that this peaceful island was once the scene of such horror. But we must remember. We must remember the soldiers who fought with incredible courage on both sides. We must remember the sailors who faced the divine wind with unflinching determination. And above all, we must remember the civilians, the men, women, and children who had no choice but to endure the typhoon of steel, and whose suffering reminds us that in war the line between soldier and civilian, between victory and tragedy, often disappears entirely. This has been the story of the Battle of Okinawa. Remember it, honor it, and pray that humanity never again unleashes such a typhoon upon the world.